All right, what is going on, guys? I am gonna wait just a minute to see if we can let a few people jump on to the channel.
When our troops don't come back.
So today I'm gonna be doing a class on preflop play. So I'm gonna wait just a minute or so for whoever's going to jump in here, and then I will start the class. All right, looks like Twitch is up and running, so that's good. All right. So today's class should be kind of short. I thought it was going to be a little bit longer. We've got about 18 slides to go through, and to be completely honest, I got a little bit worn out with preflop play. I had done a lot of this before I sort of took a hiatus from doing the classes, and as over the last few days, if you guys haven't seen it, check out my YouTube video where I talk about my 100-day goal. I am working my way to let's see. Sorry, I'm fixing the title. Preflop. And this is part this is part 2, I think. It's like section 2. Wow, it sounds like it's about to be a storm out. So, a few things I realized were that doing these classes isn't really lining up with my goals as as far as my next 100-day goal. Doing these classes, converting my knowledge into a PowerPoint, and then being confident enough to teach it, and all the work that goes into that really doesn't line up well with my goal of becoming a 400 no-limit poker player within the next 100 days. So this is going to be my last sort of evening class. I may still do some streaming, but it will more likely be reviewing hands, going through GTO solutions, things like that. Maybe playing some poker now and then just so I can get some example hands to work through. But I'm not going to do any more of these classes right now. I definitely will in the future. And who knows, my next, I'll probably keep doing these 100-day goals. The next one maybe will be to boost the viewership on my Twitch and YouTube channels. If that's the case, then lots of stuff like this will be happening, and that'll be my focus. But right now, my focus is beating 400 no limit, and because of that, I need to focus on my study and my taking notes, studying, going through solutions and things like that. So that is my plan. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do this. If I see stuff pop up in the chat, I will answer it. Otherwise, I'm going to essentially treat this video like I'm doing a YouTube video and just go through and teach the class. So we will see how it goes. Let me just check. It looks like we do have a few people in the chat, so I'm going to get going. All right, so poker pre-flop play overview. So first, an apology. And here's why. As I was doing this, I realized that is that even how you spell apology? I don't even know if that's spelled right. But as I was going through and doing this, I realized that I really didn't like doing the pre-flop stuff. This is from Matthew Janda's book, Applications of No Limit Holdem. I've gone through the pre-flop section many, many times, and there's just a lot of information in there. There's a lot of math in there, and it's all really good information, but I don't know that it is all relevant to really improving your game right away. Like, there's good math in there, there's good things to know, but towards the end of this class, it really trailed off. And if you really want to master this stuff, just you have to, go click on the links in my on my channel. If you go down to my website, if you go to my website link and go to resources, then you can find a link to the book, Applications of No Limit Holdem. So, do that and read the section. But I'm just going to kind of try to hit some of the wave tops on this class. And like I said, towards the end of this is when I realized I probably won't be doing any more classes like this right now. So with that, let's go. All right, so what are our goals with preflop play? We're not going to solve preflop play. It's really, really difficult to solve because you essentially have to have the entire game of poker solved before you can solve for preflop. So what we want to do is build a toolbox of tools and prove things that must not be right. So we can kind of prove, for example, that you can't let somebody, you can't fold to a certain size flop bet, more than a given percentage, or else it's they automatically profit on that hand. I'm not wording that perfectly, but I think you understand what I mean. If you fold to a pot size bet on the flop more than 30% of the time, or more than 66% of the time, then that person can now bet any two cards against you because they're going to automatically profit, let alone the times that they have a hand that can win. So because we know that, we know that just in general against a pot size or 3/4 pot or even half pot bet, that we need to be defending somewhere in the ballpark of 70%, 60 to 70% of the time, depending on bet size. So little things like that, which we'll get into more. So we can't solve exactly what is correct, but we can definitely solve some things that are incorrect. And so preflop, our main goal is to prevent the preflop raiser from opening too wide. All right, so what is the process we're going to use for this? We're not going to start from scratch. We can start using standard ranges and then make small adjustments through there. When we're looking at EV lost from preflop mistakes, it's generally going to be small relative to postflop mistakes. So the reason I put that in there is, don't stress too much about your preflop ranges. They are important, but you can really only make so much of a mistake preflop. Now that will lead to more postflop mistakes, but if you open a range that's a little bit too wide, but it's still balanced postflop, you're not going to lose a ton of EV. And in fact, you'll probably do okay because you've got a balanced range and you play well post-flop and your opponents may or may not. Yeah, that's sort of the last bullet. Also, guys, if you have not seen the other videos, go to my YouTube channel and check those out. They should be in a playlist there under recent uploads. All right, 3-betting, 4-betting, 5-betting war, as it's often called. So perfect sizing and frequency is very hard to solve for. Therefore, we should try to solve for what cannot be correct using the most common ranges, as we kind of already talked about. So we know that a 20, again, for all the proofs, for all the math proofs and everything, I just left that stuff out. I don't think it's that interesting, and I also don't want to put every single thing that's in the book into these slides. I want you guys to read the book. I just sort of wanted to go over some of these highlights to talk about what I learned and what I pulled from these different sections. So what's interesting is that a 20% increase in 3-bet size only changes how often the opener, meaning the person that's getting 3-bet, how much they must defend by 4%. The book is Applications of No Limit Holdem. So let me give you guys a link to the resource. Well, yeah, I'm going to link it in the chat. If you just go to rounderuniversity.com/resources, that's how you can get there. Copy link address, and let me drop this in the chat for you guys. And yeah, it's Matthew Janda's book. Holy cow! There's wow, quite a storm. All right. Players generally bet larger out of position than in position. Just as a general note, we kind of already should know that. More on 3 betting, 4 betting, and 5 betting. The assumptions he uses in the book, which are a little bit dated, and he admits are a little bit dated, are an open to 3.5 big blinds, a 3 bet to 11 big blinds, a 4 bet to 24, and then the 5 bet all in. This all obviously assumes 100 big blind stacks. Therefore, using those numbers, again, all the proofs are in the book, but 3 bluffs need to work around 67 to 70% of the time to show an immediate profit. So that means if you're folding 70% to 3 bets, you are being exploitable. And realistically, you shouldn't be folding probably more than, I don't know, like 60%, because even when you, because even, if you have equity. So you have equity. You're going to get lucky sometimes. So realistically, this gives you an idea of how often you need to be defending and how often you can spot people who are playing exploitably. And we'll get into more of this as we go. 4 bet bluffs need to work 54 to 60% of the time. What you're noticing here is they need to work less often, which means that you should be folding even less. So once you 3 bet, you need to be continuing with a lot of your range. And 5 bet bluffs need to work 40 to 50%, so even less. So what this should tell you is that you cannot be opening and 3 betting too willy-nilly, because you have to be prepared to stack off with quite a bit of your pre-flop range. Hopefully that makes sense, but think about it. If you're 3 bet and you need to call 60% of the time, and then when you're if you go ahead and raise, then you need to be prepared to defend that, raise a good amount of the time. I don't like MDF. What's MDF? All right. So each bluff needs to get less folds to show immediate profit. This math assumes opponent never calls. Obviously, that's minimum defense frequency. I don't know if I ever talked about that. Right. Yeah, so the way that this is essentially being used as a model to try and prove things. Now, on every flop, we can't necessarily the 1 minus alpha thing. I have talked about that. So it absolutely is true in some situations, but there are some spots where we're gonna have to fold exploitably depending on what the flop is and things like that. That's a little bit more advanced as far as when we're going to deviate from that, but depending on ranges, when different actions happen, we still may run into spots that our opponent can't exploit us like 100% of the time. So that still will happen. All right, so we need folds even less to profit with bluffs as each one goes up. All right, so if opponent never defends by calling, preflop opens must defend 3 bets by 4 betting 25 to 30% of the time. Again, holy crap. Okay. So 3 bet ranges which never flat should 5 bet jam 40 to 46% of the time, and 4 bet ranges should usually call the jam 50 to 60% of the time. And this will be a good place to help us start building our ranges. Again, these aren't like final numbers because we're not ever calling in this situation, but it gives us again that sort of that skeleton of what we need to do. So now let's talk about some pre-flop raise first in ranges. Since the EV of folding is 0, a player should raise first in any hand that has EV greater than 0. The worst hand in an opening range should be close to 0 EV. What that means is that we should not be... The whole idea that used to kind of be popular, I think, is, well, you want to raise some weak hands to sort of change your image and make you seem looser. That way you can, get paid with your bigger hands. That's not what we're talking about in this book. That's not what this book's about. That's not what this series is about. This is about game theory optimal play. And if we assume we're playing an optimal opponent, then the worst hand in our opening range should be very close to 0 EV. And if you don't know what EV is, or expected value, you need to watch the previous classes. Assumptions about worst hand in raised first in range. So EV should be close to 0, meaning it's probably a mixed strategy. So that means that... Right. So very close to 0 EV. That's why I think he says close to 0 EV, and not necessarily slightly negative EV. But 6, 7, 8 is correct in that it should be close to 0 and possibly negative EV. But the bottom of our range will be slightly minus EV when our opponent actually plays against us, but not when they fold necessarily. So anyway, that's a little more advanced. All right, so it's probably a mixed strategy, meaning the worst hand in your range is probably going to be a hand that you open sometimes. Because if it's that close, it probably isn't opened 100% of the time. Hand should fold frequently when facing a 3-bet, so pretty much always the worst hand in your range you shouldn't be keeping in your 3-bet, your 3-bet defending range. Hand will have a total EV of greater than 3.5 BB when called. So it's going to have an EV greater than the amount you bet when you call, because there's 1.5 BB's dead money in there. Hand will not have EV greater than 1.5 BB when it sees a flop. The worst hand in our range shouldn't expect to win more than the blinds. So to show an immediate profit on a 3.5 big blind open, opponents must fold 70%, and that's total. So when we're opening from the button, the combination of the small blind and big blind need to fold at least 70% to show immediate profit. When we're opening under the gun, the entire table has to combine to fold 70%. So that's why it's a lot harder to show profit from under the gun. All right, so now some questions about maximum 3-betting range. What 3-betting ranges are possible, and what 3-betting ranges cannot be correct? This is sort of some of the stuff that we can figure out. Now, the assumption is that all players use same 3-bet frequency from all remaining positions. Obviously, that is an assumption that won't be true in practice, but can give us some upper limits to what is theoretically the most possible. So max 3-bet ranges. Minimum defending of 30% divided by remaining players can give an idea of each player's defending frequency. We should figure out how often each player must not 3-bet in order for the opener to 3-bet less than 30%. What that math works out to is each player can 3-bet up to 6.9%. Now, if under the gun opens, then... this is, I think we're talking under the gun. I don't know if I put that in here, but I think this is talking about if under the gun opens, the max each player can 3-bet is 6.9%. Now, that probably doesn't mean that middle position can do it that much, but it might mean small blind can do it more, big blind can do it more. This is sort of the average. If a player defends against 4 bets by only 5 betting or folding, they must 5-bet 40 to 46% of the time when facing a 4-bet. In other words, he cannot fold more than 50 to 54% of the time, or else his opponent will make an immediate profit. One thing I put in here, this is the 2+2 edit. I went on the 2+2 forum for this book, and this was actually a correction from the original text. So I figured I'd put that up there in case anybody else had read this and was confused by it like I was, because it didn't really make sense. So it is actually edited and correct on this slide. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, let me know. We can go back to it. So we should fold around 55% of the time our opponent 4-bets to make him indifferent to bluffing. So that's important to realize, that we need to be ready to pretty much go for broke with 45% of our 3-bet range against an opponent who only 4-bets or folds. So when you're light 3-betting, or when you're trying to get fancy and 3-bet too much, you got to be careful against good opponents, because they are going to punish you for that, because you have to be willing to stack off with a lot of your range. Where this actually does come in and practically can be correct is there are a lot of opponents who will not call like 3-bets out of position. So we may have opponents who really don't want to call 3-bets and 4-bets out of position. So this math might actually apply to opponents that are like that, who are only going to 4-bet or fold. So yeah. If we 3-bet 6.9%, we should defend with 2.76% of total hands versus a 4-bet. And that 2.75, whatever, 76% is aces through queens and ace king. So that's important to also realize that, when we're talking about the range, this is a very tight range. This is not a lot of hands. And obviously that would be the value. That's total hands, so that might not be our exact range, because we might have some bluffs in there. So maximum 3-bet by position. So versus an under the gun player, we already talked about it, it's 6.9%, and this is averaged across all the players. Versus MP, it's 8.5, and you can read the rest. Versus cutoff, 11.2, and versus button, 16.3. No questions, moving on. This is a good starting point to see if players are 3-betting too aggressive. If 3-betting near these frequencies pre-flop, the raiser will be losing money with the worst hands in his first in range. So he is using the sizings. We talked about those earlier. The assumed sizings are an open to 3.5 big blinds, a 3-bet to 11 big blinds, a 4-bet to 24 big blinds, and a 5-bet all in, 100 big blinds. So there we go. And yes, so that means that if we are opening, if we've got somebody 3-betting more than that, then we'll be losing money with the worst hands in our range, because we're going to be folding those hands too often. Now, when we're called, the worst hand will usually lose money because it is weaker than the average hand in a pre-flop cold calling range. The pre-flop raiser will often be out of position post-flop. If we open under the gun and we get called by the button, obviously we're out of position. That makes it harder to play. And if a blind calls, there's less dead money in the pot, because they don't have to put as much additional money in. So those are all reasons why we should expect to usually lose money when called with the worst hands in our range. Okay, if opponents are playing too aggressively and 3-bet more than 30%, we will not be able to profitably open the worst hand in our theoretically optimal range. Also remember that when called, we win 0 BB. So therefore, if our opponents sometimes defend by calling, they must 3-bet less than 30% for our worst hands to break even. Again, that earlier assumption was that our opponents are 3-betting or folding. If they're also calling sometimes, and then we are usually at a disadvantage by calling, then they can't be if they're 3-betting that 6.9% and then also calling some, then we're going to be doing even worse. So they should be 3-betting less if they're also calling, which means that their theoretically correct 3-betting ranges are going to be even lower than that 6.9% or those percentages that we saw in the previous. Am I studying right now? Like right this moment, or in this current time of my life? Theoretically correct ranges can be minus EV versus certain opponents. Now think about, if you're bluffing into a guy that's a calling station, that's still going to be minus EV versus that opponent, even if it's theoretically correct. So be careful that you're not saying, oh, this is probably theoretically correct, which I'm sure I've been guilty of doing, if you are just like throwing money away because the guy's clearly just a huge calling station. So yeah, I am studying. Like today, So yeah, today I Just taking notes on, this is on the flop defending stuff that's in Matthew Janda's book. So I'm going through, I won't be doing these classes anymore, but I am still going to be doing the studying and going through, and I'll probably review some hands and some stuff like that on stream, but I won't be putting these classes together for the rest of my 100-day to 400 NL goal. Anyway, for 100 big blind stacks, players don't like to flat 3-bets out of position. We kind of just talked about that. When a player responds to 3-bets by only 4-betting or folding, they must 4-bet between 25 and 30% of their opening range. When facing 5-bet, they must call with 50 to 60% of their 4-betting range. So approximately 15.2% of the pre-flop raising range should call a 5-bet jam. Oh, yeah, no, I'm doing a class. I put this together earlier. So I've already gone through and read this chapter like 2 or 3 times, taken notes, put together all the slides and everything else, which takes too much time, and that's why I'm not going to be doing it anymore right now at this time for the next 100 days. Okay, so stated again, if the preflop raiser 4-bets 27.5% of the time and calls a 5-bet 55% of the time, he will end up felting 15.2% of his range. So this is an important frequency to keep in mind when playing against opponents who refuse to flat 3-bets out of position. Against a player like that, we need to defend at least that 15.2% of their total opening range, or else bluffing like with a hand like ace rag suited and pocket pairs is going to become profitable for them. Hopefully that makes sense. So something to keep in mind. What's going on, Jeremiah? How goes? We are almost done with today's class. We got 2 slides left. Like I said, guys, definitely check out this chapter, read this chapter, and check out all the details. I'm just hitting the wave tops because it's just really in-depth to try and go through and create a PowerPoint for all this stuff. So there is a hand chart in the book. I didn't want to put it in the slides because I feel like everybody should buy the book, whether you use my affiliate link or not. I mean, it's just a very, very good book. So based on the chart shown in this section of the book, sorry, not going to put it on the slide, against a 15%, which is sort of a typical under the gun range, raise first in, it makes very little sense to 3-bet and 5-bet a hand like queens or ace king, since our opponent will never felt worse. So if you are the type of player that gets it all in with queens under the gun, and always complains that you run into kings and aces and ace king and all that, then you're probably actually making a mistake. So blah blah. An under the gun player is only happy getting it all in with ace. Even king shows only a small profit when you 4-bet with it. So that's good information to have. The blah blah is there's a whole bunch of math that goes into that as well that's in the book. So something to keep in mind when you're playing under the gun and trying to get all your money in. Again, that also kind of goes towards those opponents who are playing against under the gun and how tight they need to be. So flatting 3-bets and 4-bets. Nope, not playing any hands right now. I probably will soon. I'm going to start putting some hands in just so I have hands, honestly, that I can review and study and break down. I'd like to have some live hands that I played to go through and solve. So I will start playing, and I will do some of it on stream. So why should we flat 4-bets? Hands in value 4-bet range are stronger than the weakest hands in the 3-bet range. So that seems kind of obvious, but that's one of the reasons why we should flat 4-bets. Whereas if we 5-bet, now some of those hands are very weak. So if in position, you lose that the advantage of position by never calling. And with overpairs, you can usually get it in on a threatening board to deny your opponent equity easily on the flop after calling. So if you've got, aces or kings and you're worried about calling, or even queens, and you find a 10 high board that's scary, 10, 8, 4 or something like that has some draws out there, then you can usually get it in on the flop and deny your opponent that equity that he might have. So for 100 BBs, it's very hard to fold. Once you 5-bet by calling 4 bets in position, you don't allow your out of position opponent to negate your positional advantage. All right, the summary for the math, read the book. Button raised first in cannot succeed more than 62.5%, or the button can open any 2 cards. The weakest hand in the button opening range will lose 2.5 big blinds every time one of the blinds 3-bets, and the blinds cannot defend by 3-betting more than 37.5% combined. So we're talking about blinds versus button. The blinds must defend more than 37.5% of the time if they ever just call preflop, and the worst hand in the button opening range is indifferent to raising and folding. Again, a mixed strategy. So, all right, guys, that is all I've got for today. This will be posted on YouTube if you missed any of it. And for a while, this will be the last class. I will do some hand history reviews and some other things like that, and do some study on stream. But as far as organized classes, this is going to be it. If you guys have questions or comments, leave them below the video on YouTube or somehow on Twitch. And until next time, I'm looking forward to streaming a little bit more, and I will see you guys later. This is U-Rounder signing off.